There is something quietly remarkable about the idea of a small island, not particularly large, not particularly warm, not particularly rich in ancient gold or fertile plains, deciding, over the course of a few centuries, that it would like to rule a quarter of the entire surface of the earth. And even more remarkable is the fact that it did exactly that. This is not a story told in the way it is sometimes told in classrooms or in textbooks. This is not a story of battles and treaties read out loud in the dry, careful language of official history. This is a slower story, a quieter one. It is the kind of story that unfolds the way fog unfolds over a harbour at night, gradually, without urgency, with a kind of inevitability that you only notice after it has already happened. So settle in, if you are already comfortable. Let the weight of your body sink a little further into wherever you are resting tonight. Perhaps you can hear, somewhere far off, the soft sound of rain against a window, or the steady, unhurried rhythm of your own breathing. Whatever sounds surround you, let them stay. They belong here, in this story, the same way distant sounds always belong in history, as atmosphere, as background, as the quiet proof that life was always going on, even as empires rose and fell around it. If you find that this channel helps you rest, you might consider subscribing to its Sleep Chrono. There are many more stories like this one, long, slow, wandering journeys through history, designed to carry you gently towards sleep. But there is no urgency in that. You're here now, and this story is already beginning. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. We're going somewhere very far away. We begin, as all good things begin, at the edge of the water. Imagine yourself standing on the southern coast of England, somewhere in the late 15th century. The year does not matter exactly. Perhaps it is 1490, perhaps a little earlier or a little later. What matters is the feeling of the place. The chalk cliffs behind you are white and immense and ancient, carved slowly by centuries of sea and wind. The English Channel stretches out in front of you, grey and restless, disappearing into a horizon that you can barely make out through the haze. The wind here is sharp and carries the smell of salt and seaweed and something else, something cold and mineral that speaks of great distances. England at this moment is a modest country. It is not a place that would naturally inspire predictions of world domination. Its population is somewhere around 3 million people. It has endured a long and miserable civil war, the Wars of the Roses, that left its aristocracy exhausted and its countryside sparsely populated. Its cities are small and smoky. London, the largest of them, has perhaps 50,000 inhabitants, which makes it a respectable European city, but only just. It has no colonies, no overseas possessions of any kind beyond a few small and contested claims. Its navy is functional, but not magnificent. Its merchants are active, but not especially wealthy by the standards of the time. Spain and Portugal have already begun exploring the coastlines of Africa and the Americas. Venice and Genoa still dominate the trade routes of the Mediterranean. England, by most reasonable assessments, is secondary power at the edge of Europe's consciousness. And yet, you might wonder, standing there at the edge of those chalk cliffs with the cold channel wind moving through your hair, whether there is something in the air that hints at what is coming, some quality of light, or of the water, or of the particular stillness of an English afternoon that carries within it the faint shape of a future empire. There probably isn't, of course. History does not announce itself in advance. The people standing on those cliffs in 1490 were not thinking about colonies or trade routes or the future map of the world. They were thinking about the price of wool, about the harvest, about whether the king, whoever the king happened to be that particular year, was going to raise taxes again. They were thinking, as people have always thought, about the ordinary things that fill ordinary days. But something was shifting, nonetheless. The shift was happening slowly, the way most important shifts happen, imperceptibly, incrementally, with no single moment that anyone could point to afterward and say, this is where it began. It was happening in shipyards and counting houses. It was happening in the minds of merchants who looked at maps and saw blank spaces, and in the minds of sailors who looked at blank spaces and saw opportunity. It was happening in the quiet accumulation of small advantages, a slightly better ship design here, a slightly more efficient trading company there, a slightly more stable political system that allowed wealth to accumulate in ways it couldn't elsewhere. The great historian Fernand Braudel once wrote that the sea was always the key, that the nations which mastered the sea were the nations that shaped the world. England had not yet mastered the sea, but it lived beside it. And living beside the sea, as any island people understands, changes you in ways that are difficult to describe. It makes you accustomed to distance. It makes you comfortable with the idea of going away, of leaving, of returning changed. It makes the horizon feel like an invitation rather than a limit. That invitation, quiet and constant and unspoken, was always there. Let us move forward a little in time, slowly and without urgency, the way you might move through a familiar house in the dark, by feel, by memory, by the faint light coming under closed doors. The year is 1497. England is under the rule of Henry VII, the first Tudor king, a cautious and quietly calculating man who understood money and power in ways that many of his contemporaries did not. Henry VII is not remembered as one of England's great romantic heroes. He does not have the flamboyance of his son, Henry VIII, or the tragic glamour of Richard III. He is remembered, when he is remembered at all, as a man who balanced the books and kept the peace, which, when you think about it, is exactly the kind of man an exhausted country needs after decades of civil war. It was Henry VII who funded a Venetian sailor named Giovanni Caboto, known to the English as John Cabot, to sail westward from the port of Bristol in search of a route to Asia. Cabot found no route to Asia. He found instead the cold, fish-rich coastlines of what we now call Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. He planted a flag, noted the extraordinary abundance of cod in the waters off the Grand Banks, and sailed home. This was, in one sense, a modest discovery. No gold, no spice routes, no civilizations rich enough to trade with. Just fog and cold water and enormous quantities of fish. Henry VII gave Cabot a reward of £10, roughly the wage of a skilled craftsman for about 3 months. And that, apparently, was that. But the fish mattered more than it seemed. The Grand Banks off Newfoundland were among the most productive fishing grounds in the world, and the dried and salted cod that English fishermen began bringing back from those waters became a significant trade good throughout Europe. More importantly, those fishermen became, without anyone quite realising it, the first regular users of the North Atlantic crossing. They learned the winds and the currents. They developed the ships and the skills. They built over the following decades a quiet, practical knowledge of the Western Ocean that would eventually make the colonisation of North America possible. This is how empires often begin, not in grand gestures of conquest, but in small, practical, unremarkable activities. A boat going out for fish, a merchant calculating whether a distant trade is worth the cost, a sailor writing down, in the margins of a rough and water-stained logbook, the direction of the prevailing winds at a certain latitude in a certain month. Small things accumulating quietly over a long time. You're still with me, I imagine, somewhere in the comfortable darkness behind your eyelids. The story is moving slowly, as it should, as all long stories should. There is no hurry. The British Empire took centuries to build, and we have all night to understand it. Let the weight of your limbs settle a little further. Let your breathing find its own easy rhythm, neither forced nor hurried. We move now to the 16th century, to a period that historians sometimes call the Age of Exploration, though that name makes it sound rather more organised and purposeful than it actually was. The exploration of the 16th century was, in practice, a chaotic, violent, often desperate scramble by the nations of Western Europe to find sea routes to the wealth of Asia, and to claim whatever unclaimed land lay along the way. The Portuguese were ahead. They had rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa in 1488, just 9 years before Cabot's voyage to Newfoundland, and by the early 1500s they had established trading posts along the coasts of Africa, India and Southeast Asia. Their route to the Spice Islands of the East Indies was long and dangerous, and required rounding the entire continent of Africa, but it worked. Portugal, a small country with a long Atlantic coastline and a tradition of seafaring, had, for a brief period, something close to a monopoly on the most profitable trade routes in the world. The Spanish, of course, had gone the other way. Columbus's 1492 voyage had given them the Americas, and the conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires in the early 16th century had delivered to Spain quantities of gold and silver so vast that they altered the entire European economy, flooding the continent with precious metal and contributing to a long period of inflation that historians are still arguing about. England watched all of this from the sidelines, not exactly indifferently. English merchants were perfectly capable of understanding what wealth looked like, but without the resources, the political will, or the particular circumstances that had allowed Portugal and Spain to move so quickly. The English were busy. Henry VIII was busy dissolving monasteries and marrying women and fighting theological battles with the Pope. The country was busy adjusting to the enormous religious and social disruptions that the Reformation had brought. There was not a great deal of energy left over for overseas empire building, but there were individuals. There were always individuals. In the middle decades of the 16th century, a small number of English merchants began organising what they called joint stock companies, a financial innovation that seems unremarkable now, but was at the time genuinely revolutionary. The idea was simple. Instead of one wealthy merchant bearing all the risk and all the cost of a trading voyage, a large number of investors would pool their money, share the costs and share the profits, or the losses, proportionally. This meant that even a relatively modest investor could participate in overseas trade. It meant that catastrophic failure, a ship lost at sea, a cargo destroyed, a trading post abandoned, would not ruin any single person. The risk was spread, diluted, made manageable. The Muscovy Company, chartered in 1553, was one of the first. The Levant Company followed. The Eastland Company, small, cautious, practical enterprises, feeling their way into distant markets with the careful, methodical patience of people who understood that the sea was dangerous and that hasty decisions were expensive. These companies were not glamorous. They were run by men in counting houses who spent their days adding up columns of numbers and writing careful letters to factors in distant ports. They wore good wool coats and ate sensible meals and went to church on Sundays. They were, in other words, exactly the kind of unremarkable, competent, practical people who actually make history, as opposed to the remarkable, incompetent, impractical people who tend to appear in history books. The joint stock company was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential inventions in the history of the world. It allowed the accumulation of capital on a scale that no individual merchant or even most monarchs could match. It separated the function of management from the function of ownership. It created a legal entity, the company, that could survive the death of any individual member. And it pointed in its quiet, accountable way toward a future in which commerce rather than conquest would be the primary engine of the empire. Though conquest, of course, was never very far behind. The year 1600. You might picture it, if you like, as a winter's evening in the city of London. The city is crowded and smoky and smells of coal fires and river mud and the particular animal odour of a pre-modern city that has not yet discovered sewers or regular street cleaning. The Thames is wide and dark and busy even in December, its surface crossed by the small, fast boats that serve as the taxis of the age. On the north bank, the city's buildings press close together along narrow streets that twist and double back on themselves in ways that make no geometric sense but a great deal of historical sense. They follow the lines of old paths, old boundaries, old arguments about who owned which strip of ground. In one of those narrow streets, or perhaps in the more substantial hall of one of the city's livery companies, a group of merchants is gathering. They are well dressed, these men, merchants of the better sort, men who can afford good wool and the occasional silk. They have been working for several years toward this moment, petitioning the Queen, assembling investors, arguing among themselves about the details of the plan. Tonight, or on some night very much like this one, the final arrangements are being made. On the last day of December in the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a charter to the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. This is the organisation we know today as the East India Company. Its initial capital was £72,000, raised from 218 investors. Its purpose was to establish trade with the spice islands of Southeast Asia, the Moluccas, the source of pepper and nutmeg and cloves and all the other spices that Europeans paid extraordinary prices for, because they made winter food edible, and European kitchens something other than grim. The East India Company began, like the Muscovy Company before it, as a cautious and practical commercial enterprise. Its first voyages were directed towards Southeast Asia. Its early results were mixed. The Dutch, who had their own East India Company, established in 1602, better capitalised and more aggressively managed than the English version, proved to be formidable competitors for the spice trade. The English were edged out of the Moluccas in a series of confrontations that culminated in the Amboina massacre of 1623, when Dutch colonists tortured and executed a group of English merchants on the island of Amboina. This setback turned out to be, in the very long run, enormously fortunate for England. Pushed out of Southeast Asia, the East India Company redirected its attention toward India, a vastly larger and richer country, with a more complex economy, and one that offered opportunities not just for spice trading, but for trading in cotton textiles, silk, indigo, and 100 other commodities. The company established its first trading post on the Indian subcontinent at Surat, on the northwest coast, in 1608. It signed agreements with the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who saw the English merchants as useful. They brought silver, which the Mughal economy needed, and they asked for trading rights, which cost the emperor nothing. Over the following decades, the company established factories, which in this context meant trading posts, not manufacturing centres, at Surat, Madras, Bombay and Calcutta. These were at first genuinely modest operations. A few hundred Europeans living in fortified compounds on the edges of Indian cities, trading and bookkeeping and arguing about prices and trying to stay healthy in a climate that was very different from the one they'd grown up in. The company had no territories, no armies to speak of, no political power beyond what the local rulers allowed it. It was a commercial enterprise, nothing more. But the Mughal Empire, which had held India together for a century and a half, was beginning to fracture. The fracturing of the Mughal Empire is a story that deserves its own long, slow evening, and perhaps we will return to it another night. For now, it is enough to know that the death of the Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707 set off a long period of instability across the subcontinent, as Mughal governors, local rulers, and foreign powers struggled to fill the vacuum left by a weakening central authority. The East India Company watched all of this with the careful, calculating attention of an organisation that understood opportunity when it presented itself. As the Mughal centre weakened, the company began building its own private army. First a few hundred soldiers, then a few thousand, then tens of thousands, a hybrid force of European officers and Indian soldiers, the latter known as sepoys, which comes from a Persian word meaning soldier. These armies were paid with company money, trained in European military methods, and equipped with European weapons. The shift that followed was one of the most extraordinary in the history of commerce and empire. An organisation that had been established to buy and sell pepper was becoming, through a combination of opportunity and aggression and cold financial calculation, the de facto government of large parts of the Indian subcontinent. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 is often cited as the turning point, the moment when the company transitioned from trader to ruler. Robert Clive, a company official who had shown an aptitude for military leadership that surprised even himself, defeated the Nawab of Bengal in a battle that was decided as much by treachery and bribery as by military force. The victory gave the company control of Bengal, the richest province in India, with a population of tens of millions and an agricultural economy producing enormous quantities of cotton, silk, rice and opium. Opium. That word sits in the history of the British Empire with a particular weight. We will come back to it. For now, let us simply note that Bengal's opium fields were enormously profitable, and that the East India Company understood profitability very well indeed. Let us pause here, as we always do in these long and wandering stories, and let the narrative settle around us like dust settling in a quiet room. You might be drifting already. The story has been moving slowly as it should, touching on merchants and sailors and the damp cold of English harbours and the heat of Indian trading posts. If you're still listening, still following the thread, perhaps you might consider leaving a quiet like on this video, or a small comment before you drift away. These things help the channel in the same gentle, unremarkable way that small advantages helped build an empire, accumulating quietly, over time, without any single great gesture. But whether you do or not, the story continues. Back to the water for a moment. Because the sea is always central to this story. England's relationship with the sea had, by the late 16th and 17th centuries, developed into something that might fairly be described as a vocation. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Part luck, part weather, part the genuine skill of English sailors and the quality of English ship design, had established England as a naval power of the first rank. Over the following century, the English Navy fought the Dutch 3 times over control of maritime trade routes, and won each time, or at least won enough to establish the principle that English ships would not be pushed around on the world's oceans. The Navigation Acts of the 17th century, dry-sounding pieces of legislation that nobody but economic historians tends to read for pleasure, mandated that goods imported into England and its colonies had to be carried on English ships. This was, in effect, a massive government subsidy for the English shipping industry. It made English merchant shipping more expensive than it needed to be in the short term, but built, over several decades, a merchant fleet and a pool of experienced sailors that became, in the long run, one of the most important strategic assets in the world. A country that has lots of sailors has lots of potential naval recruits. A country that has lots of ships has lots of potential naval vessels. A country that builds ships knows how to build them well, and continuously improves its designs through the quiet feedback loop of practical experience. By the early 18th century, England, Great Britain, after the 1707 Act of Union that joined England and Scotland, had the largest and most capable navy in the world and was building more ships every year, the Royal Navy. The phrase has a certain weight to it, a certain authority, and it deserved that authority because the Royal Navy was the single most important institution in the history of the British Empire. Without it, nothing else was possible. The colonies could not have been established. The trade routes could not have been protected. The empire could not have been defended. The navy was the spine around which everything else was built. And yet the navy of the 17th and 18th centuries was, in many ways, a deeply unpleasant institution. Its sailors were often pressed into service, literally kidnapped from ports and coastal villages by press gangs empowered by law to take any man they found and make him a sailor whether he liked it or not. The conditions aboard ship were cramped and dark and smelled of bilge water and tar and unwashed bodies. The food was terrible. Hardtack biscuit full of weevils, salt pork that had been in the barrel for months, beer that was marginally safer than the water it replaced. The discipline was brutal. Flogging with a cat o' nine tails was a routine punishment. Death by disease was far more common than death by enemy action, and yet men served. They served because the pay was regular, which in an economy where many people worked seasonally or uncertainly was genuinely valuable. They served because the navy offered a kind of adventure and a kind of belonging that was hard to find elsewhere. They served because they had been pressed and had no choice. And over time, as the navy became more established, because the traditions and the culture of the sea had become a real thing, a genuine identity, a way of being in the world that many men were proud of. The officers, of course, lived differently. A captain of a Royal Navy vessel in the 18th century was a figure of extraordinary authority, absolute master of his ship and everyone on it, answerable only to his admiral and ultimately to the Admiralty in London. He had a cabin, meals that were at least recognisably food, and the prospect, if he was lucky and aggressive and lived long enough, of prize money, the share of the value of any enemy ship captured in battle. Prize money could be considerable, and the prospect of it drove a particular kind of ferocious energy in naval officers that the mere prospect of a salary might not have produced. It was this navy, expensive, brutal, magnificent, endlessly improved by the practical experience of thousands of voyages, that underpinned everything the British Empire became. And now the island itself. Because it is easy, in a story about empire, to spend all one's time in distant places, on the coasts of India, in the harbours of the Caribbean, on the plains of Africa, and to forget that there was a home, and that the home was being changed by the empire at least as much as the empire was being changed by the home. England in the 18th century, and we should say Great Britain now, because Scotland is part of this story too, and the Scottish contribution to the British Empire is so large that it deserves its own entire evening, was undergoing a transformation so profound and so rapid that historians have been arguing about it for 200 years. The Industrial Revolution. You've heard this phrase before, probably many times. It has become one of those phrases that can wash over you without leaving much behind. A textbook phrase, a chapter heading, a set of dates to memorise. But let us try to approach it differently tonight. Let us approach it the way you might approach a building in the dark, slowly, by feel, trying to understand its shape. Imagine yourself in the north of England, somewhere in the 1770s. You are in what we now call the West Riding of Yorkshire, or perhaps in Lancashire, or in the valley of the Trent in the Midlands. The landscape here is not the gentle pastoral England of the south, not the rolling downs and the thatched cottages and the village greens that appear in watercolour paintings. This is harder country. The hills are steep and the valleys are narrow and the weather comes in fast from the west. The rivers run quickly off the high ground, which matters, because fast-running rivers can power millstones, and millstones can grind grain, and if you are clever about it, fast-running water can power machines that do things much more complicated than grinding grain. Wool has been processed in these valleys for centuries. The spinning and weaving of wool into cloth is one of England's oldest industries, and it has always been done at home, by families, on equipment that is essentially unchanged from medieval times. A spindle, a loom, patient hands working in the thin light from a small window. The production is slow and labour-intensive, and quality varies enormously from one household to another. Then someone has an idea. Actually, several people have several ideas more or less simultaneously over a period of about 30 years. James Hargreaves invents the spinning jenny in the 1760s, a machine that can spin multiple threads at once. Richard Arkwright invents the water frame, which uses the power of running water to spin thread on a scale no human hand can match. Edmund Cartwright invents the power loom in the 1780s, which mechanises weaving. James Watt improves the steam engine in ways that allow it to do useful work efficiently and cheaply. And the steam engine is the transformative device, because it can be placed anywhere, in a building, in a mine, in a ship, regardless of whether there is a river nearby. Each of these inventions is, in itself, relatively simple. None of them requires the kind of theoretical scientific knowledge that we associate with innovation today. They are in essence the products of practical people solving practical problems with available materials. But together, and in combination with the coal that lies beneath the English and Welsh hills in quantities that seemed almost unlimited, and in combination with the financial system that the joint stock companies and the banks of the City of London had spent 2 centuries developing, they create something genuinely new in the world, the factory. Not the factory in the East India Company sense, a trading post, but the factory in the modern sense. A building or a complex of buildings containing machinery powered by water or steam, operated by workers who come in at the sound of a bell and leave at the sound of a bell and are paid a wage for their time, producing goods in quantities that no earlier system of production could have imagined. In 1760, England produces roughly the same amount of cotton cloth as it has always produced. By 1830, it produces 100 times as much. The mills of Manchester and Leeds and Bradford are running 24 hours a day, their windows glowing orange in the night, their steam engines thudding with a rhythm so constant and so loud that the people who live near them stop hearing it, the way you stop hearing the sound of your own heartbeat. This is significant for the empire because it creates a dynamic that will define the next century. Britain produces manufactured goods, cloth, iron, steel, ceramics, glass, tools, machines, faster and more cheaply than any other country in the world, and it needs markets in which to sell them. The empire provides those markets. India, which has been producing its own cotton textiles for thousands of years, finds itself in the early 19th century flooded with cheap machine-made English cloth that undercuts its own hand-woven fabrics. The Indian textile industry, ancient and sophisticated, effectively collapses over the course of a few decades. Indian weavers, who have practiced their craft for generations, find themselves with no work and no income. This is not a small thing, and we should note it plainly before moving on. The Industrial Revolution and the Empire were not simply parallel developments that happened to coincide. They were entangled with each other in ways that produced enormous wealth for some and enormous suffering for others, and the suffering was not randomly distributed. It fell, with a terrible consistency, on the people who were least powerful and least able to resist it. But the empire was also building things, and some of those things were remarkable. Let us think about the railways. The railway was one of the defining technologies of the 19th century, a technology so transformative that it is difficult to overstate its effect on the experience of time and space. Before the railway, the world was organised around the speed of a horse, which is to say the world was organised around a radius of roughly 30 to 40 miles from wherever you happened to be. Beyond that radius, things became abstract. The next town, the next county, the next country. These existed in the imagination more than in direct experience. The railway abolished that radius. Suddenly, distances that had taken days could be covered in hours. Cities that had been effectively isolated from each other were connected. Goods that would have rotted before reaching a distant market could now arrive fresh. People who had never travelled more than 20 miles from their birthplace could, for the price of a train ticket, be in London in an afternoon. Britain built its railways first, and built them with a frenzied energy and a chaotic lack of coordination that seems, in retrospect, both admirable and typically British. By the 1840s, a railway mania had seized the country. Investors were pouring money into railway schemes with the same wild optimism and the same disregard for careful analysis that their descendants would one day pour into dot-com companies and cryptocurrency. Many of them lost everything, but the railways got built. And then British engineers, British capital, and British expertise went out and built railways everywhere else. In India, the railway network that the British constructed was, by any objective measure, one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 19th century. The Indian subcontinent is vast, far larger than Britain, with geography that ranges from the flat alluvial plains of the Ganges to the foothills of the Himalayas to the Deccan Plateau to the coastal lowlands of the south. Building a railway network across this terrain required tunnels through mountain ranges, bridges over rivers wide enough to seem like inland seas, stations in cities that had to be constructed from nothing in the middle of a continent that had never seen a railway before. The labour was Indian. The capital was partly British and partly raised in India. The expertise in the early decades was overwhelmingly British. Engineers who had learned their trade in the cuttings and embankments of England and Scotland, now applying that knowledge in a landscape so different from home that they must sometimes have felt they were working on another planet. By 1900, India had more than 25,000 miles of railway, the largest railway network in Asia, and one of the largest in the world. Goods could move from the cotton fields of Bombay to the mills of Lancashire in a matter of weeks. Troops could be deployed across the subcontinent in days rather than months. Famines that might have killed millions because food could not reach the starving in time could be, and sometimes, only sometimes, were alleviated by trainloads of grain arriving from regions with a surplus. The railways were a tool of empire built to serve imperial purposes. They were also unmistakably a transformation of the country they ran through, connecting India to itself in ways that had never been possible before, allowing people and ideas and goods to move across the subcontinent at speeds that were genuinely revolutionary. This is one of the deep ambiguities of the British Empire, and we would do it a disservice to pretend that the ambiguity is not there. The empire was violent and extractive and racist in ways that caused enormous and lasting harm. It was also the vehicle through which railways and telegraphs and modern medicine and new administrative systems arrived in parts of the world that might, under other circumstances, have developed these things anyway, or might not have. The historian cannot tell you how to feel about this. The historian can only note that both things were true simultaneously, and that the people who lived through them were, for the most part, quite clear about which parts of the experience they would have preferred to keep, and which parts they could happily have done without. We've been drifting through a long stretch of time, and perhaps you're beginning to feel the particular kind of tiredness that comes not from exertion, but from the gentle accumulation of detail, the way a long, slow narrative fills in around you like water filling a vessel, imperceptibly but completely. Let yourself settle into that feeling. As we continue drifting through the story, let us think about the people, Not the great names, not Clive and Wellington and Cecil Rhodes and all the figures whose names you've already encountered in other contexts. Let us think about the minor figures, the unnamed majority, the people who actually did the daily work of empire without anyone writing their biographies. Think about a young man, call him Thomas, though he might have been called anything, born in a market town in Shropshire, or perhaps in Lanarkshire in Scotland, sometime around 1840. His father is a school teacher, or perhaps a minor clergyman, or perhaps a moderately successful tradesman, the kind of family that is comfortable but not wealthy, educated but not grand. Thomas is clever, diligent, and has the kind of careful, orderly mind that does well in the examination systems that the 19th century loves. At some point in his early 20s, Thomas sits for the Indian Civil Service examination. The examination was introduced in the 1850s, part of a reform movement that sought to replace the old system of patronage and connection with a system based on competitive merit, and it is famously difficult. Candidates are tested in classics, mathematics, history, natural science, and a variety of other subjects, and the competition is intense. But Thomas is well prepared and steady under pressure, and he passes. He arrives in Calcutta, or perhaps in Bombay or Madras. In his early 20s, a young man from a small English town suddenly set down in one of the largest and most complex cities in the world. The heat is overwhelming. The noise is overwhelming. The sheer density of human life, the colours and smells and sounds, the unceasing activity of a city of hundreds of thousands is overwhelming. For a few weeks, Thomas is simply stunned, the way anyone is stunned by something utterly unlike anything they have encountered before. Then he learns the language, or at least enough of the language, and he learns the work. The administration of a district, perhaps, or a position in the revenue department, or one of the dozens of other bureaucratic functions that the empire requires. He deals with land records and tax assessments and legal disputes and public works, and the 1,000 other daily matters that keep a district functioning. He writes reports in the careful, complete, slightly formal prose that the Indian Civil Service values, and he files those reports, and the reports are read by his superiors and filed again, and eventually they disappear into the great archive of empire. He probably never becomes famous. He probably never does anything that would appear in a history book. He's simply there, one of several thousand men at any given moment who are doing the daily, unglamorous, often tedious work of administering a vast country on behalf of a government located 7,000 miles away. He misses home. He probably always misses home. He sends letters back to his parents, carefully composed letters that describe the landscape and the food and the curious customs of a country he is beginning, slowly and imperfectly, to understand. He may, over his 30-year career, travel to the hill stations, Simla, Darjeeling, Ooty, in the summer months when the heat of the plains becomes genuinely dangerous. The hill stations are strange, artificial places, carved out of the mountain landscape and made to resemble, as closely as possible, an English village, church, club, tennis courts, well-tended gardens. They are the empire's fantasy of home, transplanted to the top of a mountain in a foreign country, and they have a quality of slight unreality that even their inhabitants sometimes notice and comment on. Thomas retires eventually in his early 50s and returns to England. He lives in a comfortable house in a market town, not unlike the one he grew up in, and he grows a garden, and he occasionally gives talks at the local library about his time in India, and the people who hear those talks find him politely interesting, and occasionally fascinating, and sometimes, though they are too well-mannered to say so, slightly tedious on the subject of India and the Indians and the way things were done in his day. He is a minor figure of empire, Thomas, but there were thousands of him. Tens of thousands. and the empire could not have functioned without them. Segment 2 begins here, though you will not notice the transition, because the story continues in the same slow and measured way, moving from one quiet room to the next. Let us think for a while about what the empire actually felt like from the inside. Not from the inside of power, not from the governor's residence or the admiralty or the counting house of the East India Company, from the inside of daily life, the texture of ordinary experience as it felt to the people who were living through it on all sides of the imperial relationship. Begin in a village in Bengal sometime in the 1830s or 1840s. The village is called something in Bengali, a name that does not translate particularly well into English, a name that carries within it a long history of who settled here and why, and what the land was like before anyone settled it at all. It sits beside a river that floods every year in the monsoon season and retreats every year in the dry months, leaving behind the rich silt deposits that have made the delta of the Ganges one of the most agriculturally productive places in the world. The village has perhaps 300 families. Most of them grow rice, or jute, a tough, fibrous plant whose stalks can be processed into rope and burlap sacking, and which has become, in the last generation or two, a significant cash crop because the European market for it is large and growing. Some families grow cotton. A few specialise in weaving, turning the cotton or silk that other families produce into cloth on looms that have been in their families for generations. Life in this village is organised around the agricultural calendar, planting, growing, harvesting, processing, and around the social calendar, which means the great festivals of the Hindu year, Durga Puja in the autumn, Holi in the spring, and the dozens smaller celebrations that mark the rhythms of the community's religious life. The village has a temple, old and slightly dilapidated, its stones stained dark with centuries of incense and rain. It has a market held twice a week, where farmers and traders and craftspeople gather to exchange goods and gossip and the small essential currency of social connection. And it has, increasingly, a connection to the East India Company's administrative system. There is a revenue official who comes periodically to assess the land tax, which the company has reorganised in ways that are theoretically rational and practically often disastrous, into a fixed annual payment that does not flex with the quality of the harvest. There is a record keeper who maintains the land records. There is, in the nearest town, a court that adjudicates disputes according to a legal system that is partly Indian and partly English, and occasionally baffling to everyone involved. The villagers deal with these systems as best they can. Some families, usually those with more education, or more social connections, or both, learn to navigate the new administrative world more effectively than others, and they prosper. Others find the fixed tax impossible to meet in bad years and fall into debt, and the debt accumulates, and eventually they lose their land to moneylenders whose practices the law does not always adequately regulate. This is the economic experience of empire for many people in rural India. Not catastrophic, not uniformly disastrous, but grinding and unequal and organised in ways that consistently transferred wealth upward and outward, toward the landlords, toward the money lenders, toward the company, toward Britain. The cotton, once woven, might eventually make its way into a bale on a boat on the river, and from there to Calcutta, and from Calcutta onto a ship heading for Liverpool, and from Liverpool to a mill in Manchester, where it would be woven again by different hands working different machines, and then perhaps shipped back to India as cheap machine-made cloth to compete with the handmade cloth that the Bengali weavers could no longer sell at a price that covered their costs. The circle of empire turning slowly and expensively, at the centre of which was always the fact of distance. The distance between the people who made decisions and the people who lived with the consequences of those decisions. Now let us think about tea. Tea is one of the empire's great stories. and it is a particularly interesting one because it demonstrates how interconnected the different parts of the imperial system were, and how changes in one place could have consequences in places thousands of miles away. England discovered tea in the 17th century through its trading connections with China. The Chinese had been drinking tea for thousands of years, had developed a sophisticated tea culture, and grew the best tea in the world, or rather, the only tea that most people knew about, which amounts to the same thing. English merchants found that there was a market for it. The East India Company began importing it, first in small quantities and then in larger and larger ones, as the English discovered that tea with milk and sugar was an excellent way to make a warming drink that was also, because the water for it had been boiled, safer than most of the drinking water available in English cities. By the early 19th century, the English were drinking extraordinary quantities of tea. It had become the national beverage in a way that is difficult to overstate. Not just a drink, but a social ritual, a marker of respectability, a way of organising the day. The working-class families who moved into the new industrial cities brought tea with them, and drank it from cheap earthenware mugs in the few minutes of break they were allowed between shifts. The middle classes drank it from better china in their front parlours. The aristocracy drank it from the very best china in their drawing rooms. Tea cut across class distinctions in a way that very few things in English society managed to do. All of this tea came from China, and China was paid for it in silver. Silver drained out of Britain and into China at a rate that made the East India Company and the British government, which were by this point so closely entangled as to be sometimes indistinguishable, increasingly anxious. The trade deficit with China was real and growing, and the solution that the company found for it was one of the most morally troubling decisions in the entire history of empire: opium. The company produced opium in its Bengal territories, the famous and productive poppy fields of Bihar, and shipped it across the Bay of Bengal to China, where it was sold in exchange for silver and tea. The Chinese government objected vigorously and repeatedly. Opium addiction was a significant social problem in China, and the government could see clearly what was happening. A foreign trading company was, for essentially commercial reasons, addicting large numbers of Chinese citizens to a substance that destroyed their health and their capacity to work and their relationships with their families. The British response was, to put it charitably, unyielding. When China attempted to stop the opium trade by force, seizing and destroying a large cargo of opium in 1839, Britain responded with military action. The First Opium War, fought between 1839 and 1842, resulted in a decisive British military victory in the Treaty of Nanking, which forced China to cede Hong Kong to Britain, open 5 ports to British trade, and pay a large indemnity. The Second Opium War, fought in the 1850s, produced further concessions. These are not the Empire's finest hours, and the British were not unaware of this at the time. There were voices in Parliament, most notably William Ewart Gladstone, who would later become one of the great Victorian Prime Ministers, who described the opium trade as wicked and the wars that enforced it as a national disgrace. But commerce prevailed over conscience, as it often does, and the trade continued. The solution to the tea-silver problem was eventually found in a different way. The British established tea plantations in India itself, first in Assam, where wild tea plants were discovered growing in the jungle in the 1820s, and later in Darjeeling and Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. By the 1880s, Indian and Ceylonese tea was competing with and then supplanting Chinese tea in the British market. The opium trade continued for a while longer for commercial reasons, but its strategic justification had largely disappeared. You might find, as you drift through these details, that there is something almost dreamlike about the way the different parts of the imperial system connected and reconnected with each other. The way Bengal's opium fields connected to Chinese silver, connected to English tea, connected back to India's new tea plantations. It is a system so complex and so geographically dispersed that it seems impossible that any single group of people could have consciously designed it. And indeed, no one did. It grew, the way all systems grow, through the accumulation of individual decisions made by individual people, responding to immediate circumstances without any very clear vision of the whole. Which is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the British Empire. It was not, for the most part, planned. It was accumulated. The Caribbean. We have been in Asia for some time, and we should move slowly and without urgency to the other side of the world. The Caribbean islands, Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, the Windward Islands, the Leeward Islands, were among the earliest British colonial acquisitions and for a long time among the most profitable. They produced sugar, which is to say they produced what the 17th and 18th centuries considered one of the most valuable commodities in the world. Sugar sweetened the bitter European drinks, the coffee, the tea, the chocolate, that were becoming fashionable across the continent. It preserved fruit. It made medicine more palatable. It was used in cooking in ways that gave food a quality of luxury and pleasure that was otherwise difficult to achieve. The wealthy of Europe wanted it. The middling classes wanted it. As production increased and prices fell, the working classes began to be able to afford it, and they wanted it too. Sugar production in the Caribbean was based on enslaved labour. This is a fact, and it deserves to be stated plainly without euphemism. The plantations of Barbados and Jamaica and the other sugar islands were worked by men, women and children who had been taken from West Africa, transported across the Atlantic in conditions of extreme brutality, the Middle Passage as it was called, and forced to work under threat of violence for no pay for the rest of their lives, and whose children inherited the same condition of bondage. The slave trade was, by the measures that the economic historians use, enormously profitable. The ports of Bristol and Liverpool grew wealthy on it. Merchants who invested in slaving voyages made returns that no other investment reliably matched. The profits from the sugar trade flowed into English banks and English textile mills and English country houses and English universities. The University of Glasgow, one of the great intellectual institutions of the Enlightenment, has in recent years acknowledged that a significant portion of its early endowments came from money connected to the slave trade and Caribbean sugar production. The moral argument against slavery was made loudly and persistently by abolitionists who began organising in the 1780s. The most famous of these is William Wilberforce, a small, intense, physically unprepossessing man who spent the better part of his life fighting for abolition in Parliament. But Wilberforce would not have succeeded without the thousands of ordinary people who signed petitions, boycotted sugar, attended meetings, wrote pamphlets, and made the abolition of the slave trade a genuinely popular cause. And crucially, without the testimony of formerly enslaved people themselves, Olaudah Equiano, whose autobiography became one of the most widely read books of the late 18th century, and many others, who gave the abstract moral argument a human face and a human voice. The slave trade was abolished in Britain in 1807. Slavery itself was abolished throughout the British Empire in 1833. The formerly enslaved people received nothing in the way of compensation. Their former owners received £20 million, the equivalent of many billions of pounds in today's money, as compensation for the loss of their property. This too is a fact that deserves to be stated plainly. Africa. The continent of Africa looms large in the story of the British Empire's 19th century, and it does so in a way that changed the map of the world permanently, and set in motion forces whose consequences are still unfolding today. For most of its history, Britain's presence in Africa had been limited to coastal trading posts, mainly engaged in the slave trade until that trade was abolished, and to a handful of small colonial settlements at strategic points. The Cape Colony taken from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars, was the most significant of these. It controlled the sea route around the southern tip of Africa, which was important both for trade with India and for naval strategy. The interior of Africa was largely unknown to Europeans, except through the accounts of explorers. The continent's size and the lack of navigable rivers leading into its interior, combined with the prevalence of tropical diseases that killed Europeans at rates that made sustained penetration deeply unprofitable, had kept the European presence thin and coastal for centuries. Africa was, to the European mapmakers, largely a blank space, marked with invented geographic features and the occasional cryptic note, "Here be lions," or "unknown territory." This changed in the second half of the 19th century with extraordinary speed. The change was driven by several factors converging in ways that created what historians call the scramble for Africa, a period of roughly 25 years, from the mid-1870s to the early 1900s, during which the European powers carved up nearly the entire African continent between themselves. Quinine, the drug derived from the bark of the cinchona tree and effective against malaria, made it possible for Europeans to survive in tropical Africa, in numbers that had previously been impossible. Steamships made it possible to move troops and supplies up rivers that would have been impassable in the age of sail. Breech-loading rifles and Maxim guns gave even small European military units an overwhelming tactical advantage over African forces equipped with older weapons. And the telegraph made it possible for governments in London or Paris or Brussels to direct operations thousands of miles away in near real time. Britain entered the scramble with some reluctance and a great deal of opportunism. The British government of the 1870s and 1880s was led, for long stretches, by William Ewart Gladstone, the same Gladstone who had opposed the Opium Wars, who was deeply sceptical of colonial expansion, and genuinely believed that the empire was already large enough, and that more territory meant more expense and more responsibility. But Gladstone kept finding himself confronted with situations on the ground that seemed to demand action: a crisis in Egypt, a rebellion in the Sudan, a conflict in South Africa, and the actions taken in response to those crises accumulated into more territory, more responsibility, more empire. The logic of empire has a strange inertia to it. Each new territory creates new borders, and new borders create new border disputes, and new border disputes create new military commitments, and new military commitments create new territories beyond those commitments that seem to need protecting. Lord Salisbury, the Conservative Prime Minister, who presided over much of Britain's African expansion in the 1890s, described the process with magnificent dryness as pegging out claims for the future. Britain was not trying to colonise Africa for any single specific reason. It was trying to prevent its rivals, mainly France and Germany, from colonising it first, and in doing so, colonising it itself. By 1900, Britain controlled roughly a third of Africa: Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Gold Coast, now Ghana, Sierra Leone, Kenya, Uganda, Zanzibar, Nyasaland, now Malawi, northern and southern Rhodesia, now Zambia and Zimbabwe, Bechuanaland, now Botswana, Lesotholand, now Lesotho, Swaziland, and South Africa. The territories varied enormously in size, population, climate, resources, and strategic importance. They were administered in a variety of different ways, from the formal colonial administration of Nigeria to the more complicated settler-dominated politics of southern Rhodesia, to the unique status of Egypt, which was nominally still part of the Ottoman Empire but was, in practice, under British control. The people who lived in these territories, hundreds of millions of them, speaking thousands of languages, organised in political units ranging from great kingdoms to small bands, had not, for the most part, been consulted about these arrangements. We are drifting now into the deep, comfortable middle of this long story, and perhaps you are beginning to lose the thread in the way that is pleasant and conducive to sleep. the way a river loses the distinct channel of its source and spreads into a wider, slower, less directed flow. That is exactly right. The story does not require you to follow every detail. It will hold you, even as you let go of it. The Boer War. This war, fought in South Africa between 1899 and 1902, was the first serious signal that the British Empire was not invincible. The Boers, Dutch word for farmers, were the descendants of Dutch settlers who had arrived at the Cape in the 17th century and had, over the following 2 centuries, moved inland, away from British authority, farming the wide plains of the interior and developing a culture that was fiercely independent and deeply suspicious of outsiders. When Britain took the Cape Colony from the Dutch in 1806, the Boers were not pleased. When Britain abolished slavery in 1833, which disrupted the labour system on which Boer farms depended, they were even less pleased. Many of them packed up and moved further into the interior in a migration that became mythologised in Boer culture as the Great Trek, a kind of founding legend of proud self-sufficiency. They established 2 independent republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. These republics were poor and not particularly important to anyone, until gold was discovered on the Witwatersrand in the Transvaal in 1886. The gold deposits of the Witwatersrand were the largest in the world, or among the largest. The Transvaal, which had been a sleepy agrarian republic, became almost overnight one of the most economically significant pieces of land on earth. Johannesburg grew from nothing in a matter of years into a large, chaotic, booming city of mines and machinery, and the particular restless energy of people trying to get rich very quickly. British and other foreign miners, called Uitlanders, foreigners, by the Boers, flooded in. The Boer president, Paul Kruger, an old man with a white beard and an absolute conviction in the righteousness of his own people's cause, watched all of this with deep suspicion and refused to give the Uitlanders political rights. Cecil Rhodes, the mining magnate and Cape Colony Prime Minister, who dreamed of a British Empire stretching from the Cape to Cairo in an unbroken band of red on the map, decided that the Boer republics needed to be absorbed into the British imperial system, one way or another. His initial attempt, the Jameson Raid of 1895, a botched private military incursion into the Transvaal intended to trigger an Uitlander uprising, was a disastrous failure that embarrassed Britain and hardened Boer resistance. War, when it came in 1899, was expected to be quick. Lord Kitchener and the British public both assumed that the Empire's massive professional army would make short work of Boer farmers who rode horses and shot well, but had no organised military structure, no artillery, no logistics chain, no anything that looked like a modern army. The British commander, General Buller, telegraphed London before the campaign even began with assurances that it would all be over by Christmas. It lasted nearly 3 years. The Boers, on their home territory, using tactics that combined their intimate knowledge of the landscape with a mobile, decentralised style of fighting that military historians would later call guerrilla warfare, proved extraordinarily difficult to defeat. They did not stand in straight lines and exchange volleys with the British in the manner prescribed by military tradition. They appeared from behind kopjes, the flat-topped rocky hills of the South African veld, fired accurate rifle fire at distances that surprised and dismantled British formations, and vanished before a counterattack could be organised. Britain eventually won, but at an enormous cost. The war killed about 22,000 British soldiers, more from disease than from combat. It required the deployment of nearly 500,000 troops. It required a scorched earth strategy, burning Boer farms, destroying crops and livestock, and the establishment of concentration camps in which Boer civilians, including women and children, were interned in conditions of such poor sanitation and inadequate food that roughly 28,000 died. The camps were not deliberately murderous in the way that later 20th century camps would be, but they were the product of carelessness and indifference, and a lack of concern for civilian welfare that shocked some of the British public when journalists began reporting on the conditions. Emily Hobhouse, a British activist who visited the camps and published reports on what she found, became one of the most effective critics of the war. Her accounts of hungry, sick children in overcrowded tents, dying from measles and typhoid and the consequences of malnutrition, provoked a parliamentary inquiry and a genuine public controversy. Lord Kitchener, who was running the military campaign, found Hobhouse a nuisance. The soldiers and administrators in the camps were, for the most part, not cruel people, but overwhelmed, understaffed people dealing with a situation that no one had properly planned for. The Boer War ended in 1902 with a British victory, but a bruised one. The two Boer republics were absorbed into the British Empire, but were given significant self-government almost immediately, and by 1910 both were part of the newly formed Union of South Africa, which enjoyed effective independence in domestic matters. Britain had fought an expensive war against farmers and essentially given them back most of what they wanted as part of the peace terms. This was a pattern that would repeat itself. And now, the early 20th century. The world of 1900 is, in many ways, the high point of British imperial power. On the map, the empire covers more territory than it ever has. A quarter of the world's land surface, marked in the distinctive red that cartographers use for British possessions, stretching from Canada to India to Australia to South Africa, to hundreds of smaller islands and territories scattered across every ocean. The Royal Navy is the largest in the world, and has been for a century. British manufacturing dominates global trade, though German and American industry are growing rapidly. The pound sterling is the world's reserve currency, and the City of London is the financial capital of the world, channeling capital to railways and mines and plantations in every inhabited continent. And underneath all of this, quiet and invisible, a series of pressures are building that will, over the next 50 years, unmake everything. Some of these pressures are external. Germany's rapid industrialization and its Kaiser's stated ambition for Germany to have a place in the sun, its own empire, its own naval power, its own global influence, is creating a rivalry that will eventually become catastrophic. The United States, which has more people and more natural resources and a more dynamic economy than Britain, is growing into a power that will eventually eclipse the empire's economic dominance. Japan, which has rapidly industrialized after the Meiji Restoration of 1868, and has decisively defeated Russia in the War of 1904 to 1905, is demonstrating that the West's technological dominance is not permanent or natural but historical, and therefore reversible. Some of the pressures are internal. The empire is expensive. The Royal Navy cost money. The colonial administrations cost money. The wars, and there are always wars at the edges of an empire, small brushfire conflicts that the newspapers at home barely notice, but that drain men and money steadily, cost money. Britain is spending a great deal on empire and beginning, slowly and not yet consciously, to wonder whether the returns justify the expenditure, and some of the pressures are moral and intellectual. The ideas of the Enlightenment, human dignity, the right of people to govern themselves, the principle that all human beings are in some fundamental sense equal, have been part of British political culture since the late 18th century. These ideas are awkward for an empire built on racial hierarchy and the political subordination of large populations. British imperialists have always had to perform a certain kind of intellectual gymnastics to reconcile their Enlightenment values with their imperial practice, arguing that colonised peoples are not yet ready for self-government, that the empire is a civilising mission rather than an exercise in domination, that the trains and telegraphs and courts of law are evidence of benevolent intention. These arguments are becoming increasingly difficult to sustain for two reasons. First, because the educated classes within the colonised countries are absorbing the same Enlightenment ideas and pointing out, with devastating precision, that those ideas argue against rather than for the continuation of imperial rule. And second, because the empire's behaviour, the Boer concentration camps, the opium trade, the famines in India that killed millions while the colonial administration continued to export grain, keeps providing evidence against the benevolence narrative. The First World War. If there is a single event that marks the beginning of the end of the British Empire, though empires do not end at single events, they end gradually, the way that health fails, through the accumulation of many small deteriorations. It might be the First World War. Britain entered the war in August 1914, when Germany invaded neutral Belgium in the opening move of the Schlieffen Plan. The British casus belli was the defence of Belgian neutrality, guaranteed by a treaty that the German Foreign Secretary dismissively called a scrap of paper. Britain, which had its own reasons for not wishing to see Germany dominate continental Europe, was not going to allow that particular scrap of paper to be dismissed without response. The Empire went to war alongside Britain. This was partly because the colonies had no formal choice. They were, in law, part of the British Empire, and when the Empire went to war, they went to war. But it was also because many people within the self-governing dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, felt genuine attachment to Britain and genuine conviction that Germany's aggression needed to be met. Australia and New Zealand soldiers, the Anzacs, fought at Gallipoli in the Middle East, on the Western Front, with a courage and a sacrifice that became foundational to both countries' national identities. India contributed more than 1 million soldiers to the war effort, the largest volunteer army in history at that point. Indian soldiers fought in France, in Mesopotamia, in East Africa, in the Middle East. They died in huge numbers. The Punjabi troops on the Western Front encountered barbed wire and poison gas, and the grinding horror of trench warfare, and they endured it with the same stoicism and courage as everyone else in those trenches, which is to say imperfectly and at enormous cost. The Indian soldiers who returned from the war, who had seen France, who had been treated at least sometimes as equals by soldiers from other countries, who had heard the political arguments circulating in Europe about national self-determination and democracy, came home to a country where they were still subjects, still governed by a foreign power that assumed the right to make decisions about their lives without their consent. The gap between the democratic values for which Britain claimed to be fighting and the realities of colonial rule was not lost on them. It was not lost, more broadly, on the political movement that was beginning to coalesce in India under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, who'd returned to India in 1915 after years in South Africa, where he had developed his theory of non-violent resistance. Gandhi was a small, thin, mild-mannered man with extraordinarily large ears and an absolutely unshakable conviction that the British, if confronted consistently and peacefully with the consequences of their own actions, would eventually be embarrassed into doing the right thing. He was not entirely wrong about this, though it took longer than he hoped. The interwar period. This is a strange time in the history of the Empire, a time of surface confidence and underlying anxiety, of grand ceremonies and quiet doubt, of the Empire at its greatest geographic extent and its first serious internal crises. In 1919, the Amritsar massacre. Amritsar is a city in the Punjab, home to the Golden Temple, the holiest site in the Sikh religion. On April 13th, 1919, a large crowd of unarmed civilians, men, women, children, gathered in a walled garden called the Jallianwala Bagh, some to attend a festival, some to protest the arrest of local political leaders, many simply curious about what was going on. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer arrived with a force of 50 soldiers and, without giving the crowd any warning or any order to disperse, ordered his men to open fire. The firing continued for approximately 10 minutes until the soldiers' ammunition was nearly exhausted. The Jallianwala Bagh had only one entrance and exit. The crowd had nowhere to go. When the firing stopped, approximately 379 people were dead by the official count. Other estimates put the number higher, and more than 1,000 were wounded. Dyer, when asked to explain his actions to an inquiry, said that he had intended to produce a moral effect throughout the Punjab. He said he had not given a warning because he did not consider it necessary. He said he would have used the armoured cars he'd brought if they would have fit through the entrance to the garden. The inquiry censured Dyer, and he was forced to resign. But a significant portion of British public opinion, particularly in the conservative press and among those who had lived and worked in India, defended him, arguing that the Punjab was on the verge of rebellion and that firm action had been necessary. A collection was taken up among Dyer's supporters that raised a substantial sum of money for him. The House of Lords passed a motion supporting him, which the House of Commons subsequently overturned. The Amritsar massacre radicalised a generation of Indian nationalists, including Jawaharlal Nehru, who would later become independent India's first Prime Minister. It shattered, for many Indians, any remaining belief that British rule, whatever its incidental benefits, was something other than an occupation maintained by force. For Gandhi, it confirmed what he had already believed, that independence could not be negotiated politely. It had to be demanded consistently, insistently, and without violence, but also without yielding. Segment 3 begins here, though the transition is as imperceptible as all the others, the story simply widening to take in more of the world. Let us look, for a while, at how other empires compared. The French Empire, at its peak in the early 20th century, controlled large territories in western North Africa, Indochina, now Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, Madagascar, various Caribbean islands, and scattered possessions elsewhere. It was, in terms of territory, the second largest empire in the world. The French approach to empire was, in theory, quite different from the British approach. France espoused a principle of assimilation, the idea that the peoples of its empire would eventually be incorporated into French civilization, becoming French citizens in the fullest sense. The British approach was typically one of indirect rule, working through existing local institutions and hierarchies, preserving cultural difference while maintaining political control. Neither approach, in practice, looked quite as clean as its theoretical formulation. French Indochina was a profitable colony, producing rubber from vast plantations in Vietnam and Cambodia that used labour under conditions that varied from the merely harsh to the genuinely brutal. French West Africa was a source of agricultural commodities and, during both world wars, of soldiers, the tirailleurs sénégalais, the Senegalese rifles, who fought under French command in Europe and the Middle East in large numbers, and who returned home with the same conflicted experience as Indian soldiers who had served under the British. The Dutch Empire, concentrated mainly in what is now Indonesia, then called the Dutch East Indies, was organised around a system of forced cultivation that required Indonesian farmers to devote a percentage of their land and labour to growing crops for the Dutch market. This cultivation system was introduced in the 1830s and was, for the Dutch economy, enormously profitable. For Indonesian farmers, it was a system of organised extraction that caused periodic famines when the demands of the cultivation system conflicted with the demands of feeding local populations, the Belgian Congo. It would be possible to spend an entire evening on the Belgian Congo. and perhaps we will return to it another night. For now, let us note that the Congo Free State, as it was initially called, was the personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium, not a Belgian colony, but the private estate of a single man, and was run from the 1880s to 1908 as one of the most systematically brutal colonial enterprises in history. The rubber trade in the Congo was enforced by a system of hostage-taking and mutilation that killed millions of people and left an impression on Congolese society that is still visible today. The British, to their credit, were among the most vocal international critics of Leopold's regime, and British journalist E.D. Morel and British consul Roger Casement played central roles in exposing the Congo atrocities to international attention. The Congo Free State was transferred to the Belgian government in 1908 as a result of this international pressure, and conditions improved, though improved is a relative term. This is again one of the deep ambiguities of empire. Britain, which maintained its own empire by force and had its own record of violence and extraction, was also the country that most actively pressed for the abolition of the slave trade internationally, that most persistently criticised the excesses of other colonial powers, and that, eventually, gave independence to its colonies without the wars of liberation that ended other empires. These things are all simultaneously true, and the historian holds them in tension, resisting the temptation to let any one of them cancel out the others. The Second World War. If the First World War cracked the foundations of the British Empire, the Second World War broke them. Britain entered the war in September 1939 with an empire intact but an economy already strained by 20 years of slow recovery from the First World War, the Depression of the 1930s, and the costs of rearmament in the late 1930s. The empire went to war again. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, and dozens of smaller territories all contributing soldiers, sailors, airmen, material, and money. The scale of the imperial contribution was again enormous. India alone mobilised 2.5 million soldiers, the largest volunteer army in history. But the war changed everything. The fall of Singapore in February 1942, when the supposedly impregnable British fortress city surrendered to a Japanese army that had advanced down the Malay Peninsula on bicycles, was one of the most psychologically devastating events in British imperial history. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history, but its significance went beyond the military. It demonstrated in the clearest possible way that Britain could not protect its Asian empire against a determined Asian power. The myth of European invincibility, which the empire had always depended on at least as much as it depended on actual military power, was shattered in a matter of weeks. The Indian soldiers who survived Singapore captivity under the Japanese, and the ones who had seen the fall of Malaya and Burma, came home to a very different political landscape. The Japanese had made a point, in their propaganda and sometimes in their treatment of captured Indian troops, of presenting themselves as liberators of Asia from European colonial rule, a cynical argument given Japan's own imperial ambitions in China and elsewhere, but an argument that resonated for people who'd lived their entire lives under British rule. And Britain itself emerged from the war exhausted and indebted. The country had spent everything it had, and much that it had borrowed from the United States, which had insisted on tough terms for its Lend-Lease assistance. By 1945, Britain owed the United States an enormous sum that it would take decades to repay. Its cities had been bombed, its industry needed rebuilding, its people were tired, and they were, in the election of July 1945, voting for a Labour government that promised not imperial glory, but hospitals and housing and a welfare state. The cost of maintaining the empire, which had always been manageable relative to the empire's economic returns, now looked different in the context of a country whose own people were queuing for bread and sleeping in bomb-damaged houses. The political will for empire was draining away, not dramatically but steadily, the way colour drains from a fabric that has been washed too many times, the independence of India. August 15th, 1947. This is perhaps the single most consequential date in the history of the British Empire's end, not because it was the first independence. Ireland had effectively become independent in 1922, but because India was the Empire's most important possession. The jewel in the crown, the place that had justified and organised and given purpose to more of the imperial system than any other territory. The transfer of power was planned and executed in a state of chaos that belied the British administration's reputation for orderly management. Louis Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, had been given the task of overseeing the process of independence and had decided, apparently partly on grounds of efficiency, partly out of personal impatience, to move the date forward by 10 months from the June 1948 deadline originally set. The boundary between the new nations of India and Pakistan, drawing the lines between Muslim-majority and Hindu-majority areas, was drawn by a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe, who had never been to India before, who was given 5 weeks to complete the task, and who worked from maps and census data in an office in Delhi, while the country he was dividing with a pen was descending into communal violence. The violence that accompanied partition was catastrophic. Between 1 and 2 million people were killed in the communal massacres that accompanied the great population transfers, Hindus and Sikhs moving from Pakistan to India, Muslims moving from India to Pakistan, that took place in the months following independence. 15 million people were displaced in one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Trains crossed the new border carrying dead passengers who had been attacked by mobs along the way. None of this was intended by the British government, but it was, in important ways, enabled by the haste with which the transfer of power was managed, and by the political dynamics that decades of British divide and rule policy had helped to create. The British had long found it useful, in administering India, to emphasise and sometimes to sharpen the distinctions between different religious and ethnic communities. Hindu and Muslim political identities had been organised in part through electoral systems that reserved seats for religious communities, a practice that had made religious identity politically salient in ways that complicated the project of building a unified national movement for independence. These are not comfortable thoughts. They are, however, part of the story. The independence of India did not immediately trigger a general dissolution of the empire. Britain still controlled large territories in Africa, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. There were still British governors in dozens of territories, still British administrators filing their careful reports, still British soldiers stationed at points around the world, still the RAF and the Royal Navy maintaining something that could plausibly be called global reach. But the logic had changed. Once India was gone, the argument for maintaining the rest of the empire became harder to sustain. India had been the military and economic base from which the rest of the Asian empire was projected. Indian soldiers had garrisoned British territories across Asia. Indian revenue had funded British operations. Indian ports had supplied British ships. Without India, the strategic rationale for keeping Burma and Malaya and the Gulf states and the East African territories became much thinner, and the costs were rising. Britain was fighting in the late 1940s and the 1950s a series of colonial insurgencies that were draining its military resources and its international reputation simultaneously. The Malayan Emergency, a communist insurgency in Malaya that lasted from 1948 to 1960, required a large military commitment and innovative counterinsurgency tactics, that eventually produced a British military victory, one of the few genuine successes in post-war counterinsurgency history. But it was expensive and it was long, and it consumed attention and resources that Britain could ill afford. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, which began in 1952, was suppressed with a brutality that shocked even some British officials. Mass detentions, torture in detention camps, collective punishments. A belated legal settlement in 2013 saw the British government acknowledge that Kenyans had been tortured in detention camps and offer a compensation payment to survivors. This was 60 years after the events in question, which gives some sense of the pace at which imperial reckoning proceeds. And then, in 1956, Suez. The Suez Crisis is perhaps the clearest single demonstration that the British Empire was over. Not declining, not adjusting, but genuinely finished as a world power capable of independent action. The background is complicated, but the essential story is this. Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalised the Suez Canal Company in July 1956, taking it from the British and French shareholders who had owned and operated it since its construction in the 19th century. The canal was a crucial artery of world trade, and especially of British trade. A very large proportion of Britain's oil supply passed through it. The British and French governments decided, in secret coordination with Israel, to reclaim the canal by force. Israel invaded Egypt in October 1956. Britain and France issued an ultimatum calling on both sides to stop fighting, an ultimatum designed to fail, since Israel had been told in advance that it should not comply, and the failure of the ultimatum would give Britain and France a pretext to intervene. When the ultimatum was rejected, British and French forces landed in the canal zone, capturing Port Said and beginning an advance down the canal, and then the United States told them to stop. The Eisenhower administration, furious at being kept in the dark about the collusion, the secret planning between Britain, France and Israel had been kept from the Americans, applied decisive pressure. The US threatened to sell its pound sterling reserves, which would have caused the pound to collapse. The International Monetary Fund refused to extend a loan to Britain until there was a ceasefire. The British economy was in no position to withstand this kind of pressure. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, who had staked his political career and it seems much of his psychological equilibrium on the success of the operation, was forced to accept a ceasefire without having achieved any of his military objectives. He resigned in January 1957, broken in health and spirit. The Suez Canal remained under Egyptian control. Suez demonstrated, in terms that could not be argued with, that Britain could not act in the world without American approval. The special relationship between Britain and the United States, which would become one of the organising principles of British foreign policy for the next half-century, was, at bottom, a relationship between a former great power and its successor, a relationship in which Britain retained prestige and influence and the ability to be heard, but in which real power had definitively passed elsewhere. The empire, in the political and strategic sense that had given it meaning, was over. And now the last section begins, the slowest part, the part where the story turns to small things, quiet things, the texture of endings. Let yourself sink a little further into wherever you are resting. The story is moving more slowly now, like water moving across flat ground, spreading out, losing direction, finding all the tiny channels and hollows that direct it without any obvious urgency. In January 1960, Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, a tall, slightly theatrical man with a walrus moustache and an Edwardian manner that sat oddly in the television age, stood before the Parliament of South Africa in Cape Town and delivered a speech that became one of the most famous of the 20th century. "The wind of change," he said, "is blowing through this continent." He was speaking about Africa. He was telling South Africa's white government, which was in the process of formalising the apartheid system, that African nationalism was a reality that could not be stopped, and that Britain intended to move with it rather than against it. It was a measured, diplomatic, slightly melancholy speech, delivered in the tone of a man who has looked at the situation clearly and arrived at an honest assessment, even if the assessment is not comfortable. The wind of change. Over the following decade, that wind moved through Africa with an almost mechanically regular rhythm. Ghana had already become independent in 1957, the first sub-Saharan African country to achieve independence from Britain. Nigeria followed in 1960, the same year as Macmillan's speech. Then Sierra Leone in 1961. Uganda in 1962, Kenya in 1963, Zambia in 1964, the Gambia in 1965, Botswana and Lesotho in 1966, Swaziland in 1968. Each independence was, in its way, an event with its own specific texture, its own characters, its own particular combination of ceremony and anxiety and hope. The flag lowerings. This is what the endings looked like, in practice. A night in a city somewhere in Africa or Asia or the Caribbean. A parade ground or a public square or the lawn in front of the government house. A crowd gathered in the warm darkness, some of them carrying the new flag, some of them holding children on their shoulders so the children can see. A band playing British march music in the familiar and by now slightly absurd way, and then stopping and waiting. A group of British officials in their best dress uniforms standing very straight in the humid air. At midnight the Union Jack comes down. The lowering is performed with the precise ceremony that the British do precisely and ceremoniously. A soldier unfastens the rope. The flag descends, folded carefully, handed to the last governor's aide. The new flag goes up in its place. Different colours, different symbols, representing a different story about who owns this land and who has the right to speak for its people. And then it is over. The governor boards a plane. His staff packs the final files into boxes. The boxes are shipped back to Britain, where they will sit in archives in Kew, in southwest London, available to researchers with the appropriate permission. The colonial buildings, the government houses and the courthouses and the army barracks, pass to the new governments, who will use them or not use them as they see fit. The flags that came down were collected and stored. Some of them are in museums now. Others are in the attics of the families of the last governors, folded carefully in boxes that nobody opens very often. Let us think about what those final years of empire look like in the smaller details. Imagine a district officer, the equivalent of our Thomas from earlier in the story, but now a figure near the end of the imperial era. Call him Geoffrey. He's perhaps 45 years old, has served in Africa for 20 years, and knows the district he administers better than almost anyone else. The names of the village headmen, the pattern of the rainy seasons, the particular disputes about land and water rights that recur every year, the history of the community going back generations. Geoffrey is aware in the late 1950s that something fundamental is changing. There are more educated African men in senior positions in the administration than there were a decade ago. This is partly the result of deliberate policy, a recognition that eventually the colony will need to be run by Africans rather than Britons. There are nationalist political movements organising in the towns and cities, printing newspapers and holding rallies, articulating demands for independence in the language of Enlightenment liberalism that the British educated classes have always claimed to value. Geoffrey's relationship with independence is complicated. He is not, in his private thoughts, opposed to it in principle. He believes, probably correctly, that the territory he administers is not yet ready for the full apparatus of democratic self-government. The civil service is not large enough or experienced enough. The legal system needs development. The health infrastructure is inadequate. He is, in other words, a genuine believer in the paternalism that underlies the civilizing mission narrative of British colonialism. The idea that the British are in Africa not for what they can extract from it, but to prepare it for a better future. Whether this belief is self-serving is a question Geoffrey probably does not examine too closely. In the evenings, Geoffrey sits on the veranda of his house, a solid colonial-era building with thick walls and shuttered windows, and a garden that his wife has spent years making beautiful, and drinks a gin and tonic and listens to the sounds of the African night, the insects, the distant dogs, the occasional truck on the road that connects his town to the provincial capital. The gin and tonic is itself a piece of imperial history. Quinine was added to tonic water to provide a dose of the anti-malarial drug, and the British in tropical territories drank it mixed with gin, because gin was what they had. The habit persisted long after the quinine in commercial tonic water dropped to levels that were medicinally insignificant. Empire, even in small things, leaves its traces. Geoffrey's children are growing up partly in Africa and partly at school in England. They write letters home that describe English weather, always the English weather, cold and damp and somehow comforting in its predictability. And English food, and English friends who find it exotic and slightly unbelievable that their parents live in Africa. The children are developing an identity that belongs, not quite completely, to both places. That is, Geoffrey thinks, the condition of the colonial officer's family. Belonging everywhere and nowhere entirely. In the last year before independence, Geoffrey works alongside the incoming Africans who will take over his job. He tries to be genuinely useful, transferring knowledge, explaining the filing systems, introducing his successors to the village headmen, making sure the institutional memory doesn't evaporate when he leaves. He is, in this final work, doing something that is genuinely valuable, even if it is the coda to an enterprise that should not have lasted as long as it did. On the night of independence, he stands in the crowd outside the government house and watches the flag come down, and he feels what? It is difficult to say. Something that is not quite pride, and not quite grief, and not quite relief. Something that belongs to the experience of being present at an ending. He flies home to England a few weeks later. He gets a job in the civil service. He lives in a house in Surrey and grows vegetables in the garden on weekends, and in the evenings reads books about Africa and feels always the slight unreality of being a man whose most important life happened somewhere else. And now we should think about the empire at home. The empire as it existed in the daily life of the British people, not the merchants and administrators and soldiers who built and maintained it, but the ordinary citizens who grew up inside it without having any particular choice in the matter. The British Empire was, for most British people most of the time, a background fact rather than a foreground concern. You might encounter it in the products you bought, the Indian tea, the West Indian sugar, the Canadian timber, without thinking particularly about where those things came from, or the systems that produced them. You might encounter it in the newspapers, whose reports from Kabul or Calcutta or Nairobi appeared alongside reports from Manchester and Birmingham, as if the empire was simply an extension of Britain itself, which was, in a sense, exactly what the empire believed itself to be. You might encounter it in the schools, where history was taught in ways that presented the expansion of the British Empire as a largely benevolent and progressive story. The spread of civilization, the end of the slave trade, the construction of railways and hospitals and schools. The school books did not dwell on the Jallianwala Bagh, or the concentration camps of South Africa, or the famines of Ireland and India. They dwelt on Drake and Raleigh and Clive and the Thin Red Line at Balaclava and Gordon at Khartoum. Children in British schools in the 19th and early 20th centuries grew up knowing, with the unexamined certainty that children have about the world they're born into, that being British was a particular kind of thing, and that being British meant being part of an empire, and that the empire was something to be proud of. The maps on the classroom walls, always the pink or red maps that showed British territory in a distinctive colour, reinforced this message visually. A quarter of the world, the same colour as Britain. It would be difficult to look at that map every day and not absorb some sense of its implications. The empire came home in other ways too. The goods that flowed into Britain from the empire created habits and tastes that became deeply embedded in British culture. Tea, as we've already discussed, became so completely integrated into British daily life that its imperial origins became invisible. It simply was something British people drank, as natural and unremarkable as breathing. Curry, Indian spiced food, adapted and modified by British soldiers and administrators who encountered it in India and brought versions of it home, began appearing in British restaurants and then in British kitchens from the 19th century onward, well before the post-war immigration from South Asia that is sometimes credited with introducing it. Rubber, which came mainly from Malaya and West Africa, made possible the bicycles and later the motor cars that transformed British mobility. Jute from Bengal was made into the sacking and rope that were essential to British agriculture and industry. Timber from Canada and Australia built British houses. Cotton from India and Egypt clothed British bodies. Phosphates from Pacific islands fertilised British fields. The empire was, in this sense, woven into the fabric of ordinary British life, in ways that were invisible precisely because they were so pervasive. And then the people came the other way. After the Second World War, Britain found itself with severe labour shortages. Its workforce had been depleted by 6 years of war. Its industries needed rebuilding. The health service that the Labour government has just established needed nurses and bus conductors and hospital porters and all the other workers that a large public healthcare system requires. The British Nationality Act of 1948 gave citizens of Commonwealth countries the right to live and work in Britain. The government, and more practically, the industries and public services that needed workers, encouraged immigration from the Caribbean, from India, from Pakistan. The Empire Windrush, the troop ship that arrived in Tilbury in June 1948, carrying 492 passengers from the Caribbean, has become the symbol of this movement, the beginning of a transformation that would permanently change the ethnic and cultural composition of Britain. The people who came on the Windrush and the ships and planes that followed them were, in many cases, coming to a country they had been taught to think of as the mother country, a place whose language they spoke, whose institutions they knew, whose culture had been presented to them throughout their education as the pinnacle of civilization. What they found, often, was a country whose citizens had not received the same lesson in reverse, a country that did not know the empire that it had built, did not know the people who had lived under it, did not know the relationship that connected them. The racism that many Caribbean and South Asian immigrants encountered in 1950s and 1960s Britain, the no blacks, no dogs, no Irish signs in boarding house windows, the discrimination in housing and employment, the social hostility, was, in one sense, simply the racism that has always existed in human societies when unfamiliar people arrive. In another sense, it was a particular and revealing irony. The people who had built and maintained the empire did not want the empire's subjects to move into their streets. This too is part of the story of the empire, its ending, its legacy, its long and complicated aftermath. We are past the great events, past the battles and the treaties and the independence days. We are in the long aftermath, the quiet settling of a very large thing that has ended but whose traces are everywhere. Let yourself drift a little more freely now. The story does not require strict attention. It only asks that you be present in whatever way you are able in this slow and quiet space. Think about a morning in London in the 1970s. The city is changing. The old empire is legally gone. The last major African territories have been independent for a decade. The Caribbean islands have their own governments. India has had its own government for 25 years and has tested its own nuclear device. The sun, famously, has set on the British Empire, but the traces remain everywhere. The Commonwealth, the loose association of former British territories that replaced the empire, still meets, still has its games, still uses a kind of shared diplomatic language that is, in its own way, a remnant of the imperial system. The Queen is still the head of the Commonwealth, and still the formal head of state of 16 countries, from Canada to Australia to Jamaica. These are mostly historical formalities. The Queen's power in these countries is largely ceremonial, but they are formalities that mean something to the people who maintain them, and they are a reminder that the relationships built by empire did not simply evaporate when the flags came down. The Indian restaurants on Brick Lane, the Jamaican record shops in Brixton, the Pakistani communities in Bradford and Birmingham, the Gujarati shops in Leicester, these are the empire returned home. These are the physical, human, cultural consequences of the movement of people and goods and ideas that the empire set in motion, consequences that are now as British as anything else, as permanent and as unremarkable and as complicated as everything else that makes Britain what it is. Think about a Sunday afternoon in an English city, sometime in the 1980s. It might be Southall in West London, where Sikhs from Punjab have built a community that maintains its language and its customs and its religion, while also participating fully in British life. There are temples here that look as if they have always been here, as established and as solid as the Victorian terraced houses around them. The smell of spices comes from the restaurants and the food shops. Children play on the street, shouting to each other in a mix of Punjabi and English that flows together easily, naturally, the way water finds its own level. This is Britain now. This is what the empire made. Or think about a museum. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London, or the British Museum, or any of the great Victorian institutions that were built partly from imperial wealth and partly from a Victorian enthusiasm for collecting and categorising the world. Walk through the Indian galleries. The objects here came from India through various means, some purchased, some given as diplomatic gifts, some acquired in circumstances that were less voluntary. They are beautiful objects, textiles woven with a skill that is breathtaking even centuries later, carved stonework of extraordinary delicacy, metalwork, miniature paintings, manuscripts. They tell a story about Indian civilization that is long and rich and complex and has nothing to do with the British Empire, and yet here they are, in London. Conversations about whether these objects should be returned to their countries of origin are ongoing, and they are conducted with varying degrees of heat and clarity. Some objects have been returned, many have not. The museums argue that they are better preserved here, more accessible to international visitors, more safely housed. The countries of origin argue that their heritage belongs to them, and that its absence is itself a kind of continuation of the imperial relationship. Both arguments contain truth. The question is not simple, and it will not be resolved simply. We are near the end now, not the end of the story. The story of the Empire's legacy has no end in sight, and historians will be writing about it for centuries to come. But the end of this particular evening's telling, let the details settle around you like snow settling on a quiet landscape. They do not need to be held precisely. They only need to be received. The British Empire lasted in various forms, from the late 16th century to the late 20th. At its peak, it covered a quarter of the world's surface and governed a quarter of the world's people. It built railways and abolished the slave trade and caused famines and established universities and tortured prisoners and created the legal foundations that dozens of independent countries inherited. It was many things simultaneously, and none of the single-word judgments that tend to be applied to it, magnificent, monstrous, necessary, unjustifiable, does it complete justice. It ended faster than anyone expected, not because it was defeated militarily, but because the world changed around it and the will to maintain it evaporated. The economic logic weakened. The moral case became untenable. The political energy ran out. Empires, it turns out, do not need to be destroyed from the outside. They can be eroded from within by the slow accumulation of doubt and exhaustion, and the recognition that what once seemed necessary has become merely habit. Britain is still adjusting to the loss of empire, 70 years after the process of decolonisation began. The debates about national identity, about immigration, about Britain's place in Europe and in the world, these debates are all in some sense debates about what Britain is when it is no longer an empire. The answer is still being worked out. It will take a long time. It will never be entirely complete. That is the nature of endings that are not really endings. The empire is gone, but its consequences remain. The way a stone removed from a riverbed leaves a hollow that the water remembers and keeps returning to. The water flows over it and moves on, but the shape of the hollow persists in the current's memory. Think now about all the ordinary mornings in all the places where the empire reached. A morning in Calcutta sometime in the early 20th century. The monsoon has just passed and the air is clean and heavy with the smell of wet earth. The streets are beginning to fill with the day's traffic. The ox carts and the rickshaws and the men carrying loads balanced on their heads, with the easy, practised posture of people who have been doing it their whole lives. The sound of temple bells carries through the warm air. Somewhere someone is frying flatbreads on a tower, and the smell of the hot bread and the oil mixes with the smell of the river, and the flowers that vendors are arranging into garlands near the temple steps. A morning in Lagos, sometime in the 1950s. The city is growing rapidly, drawing people from the countryside in the way that all cities in the middle of the 20th century are growing. The rural population following the money and the opportunity, and the particular urban energy that is different from anything available in the villages. The streets of Lagos are loud and colourful, and smell of diesel and the sea. The markets are already busy, the vendors arranging their goods with the practised efficiency of people who do this every day and have optimised the process over years. A morning in Kingston, Jamaica. The hills behind the city are purple in the early light. The Blue Mountains, the source of the coffee that is considered among the best in the world. The harbour is quiet. Fishing boats are going out. Children are walking to school in white uniforms that they will not quite manage to keep clean by the end of the day. The British are still technically in charge, though independence is coming within a few years, and everyone knows it, and the knowing has changed the feeling of the morning in ways that are difficult to articulate. A morning in Sydney, Australia. The harbour is extraordinary. Everyone says so, and everyone is right. The light on the water in the morning is different from any other light, a particular blue gold that is distinctly Australian, the light of a place where the sun is always slightly more intense than you expect. The city is growing. The people of Sydney are, like all people everywhere, mostly thinking about ordinary things. What to have for breakfast, whether the bus will come on time, what is happening at work today. All of these mornings are part of the same story. All of these places were shaped, in different ways and to different degrees, by the same distant island. All of them are now independent. All of them are writing their own stories. All of them carry the traces of what the British Empire was. The hour is very late now, wherever you are. Or perhaps it is early. The kind of early that feels more like late. The the hour when the difference between the two dissolves and time becomes something approximate and soft. The story of the British Empire is a long story about many things, about ambition and greed and genuine idealism, and the way these three things tangle together in ways that cannot be separated. It is a story about the sea and about the ships that crossed it, and about the winds that the sailors learned to read like a language. It is a story about money, and about how money moves through the world and leaves its marks everywhere. It is a story about people, the millions of ordinary people who live their lives inside the imperial system without having chosen it, and the other millions who built and administered and profited from it, and who also, for the most part, did not choose it so much as find themselves within it. It is a story that does not have a clean ending, because history does not have clean endings. It flows on, changing shape as it goes, losing some threads and picking up new ones, moving in directions that nobody anticipated, and ending up in places that nobody planned. That is perhaps the most important thing the story of the British Empire teaches us. That the largest human projects are almost never the products of clear intention. They emerge from the accumulation of small decisions made in conditions of uncertainty, by people who could not see what their decisions would eventually add up to. The merchants who funded the first East India Company voyages did not imagine that they were creating the structure that would eventually govern India for 2 centuries. The sailors who charted the Atlantic winds did not imagine that they were building the infrastructure of a global empire. The politicians who responded to each local crisis with a small colonial intervention did not imagine that they were adding, one piece at a time, to a quarter of the world's surface. Things grow, things change, things end, and then new things grow in the space where the old things were. If you have been listening to this story all the way through, or if you drifted and came back and drifted again in the comfortable and slightly fragmented way that long stories invite, then you have spent some time in a very large and complicated world. You have moved through English harbours and Indian trading posts and African savannas and Caribbean islands and the corridors of museums and the verandas of colonial houses. You have heard, at a great distance, the sounds of ships and markets and temple bells and the lowering of flags. All of that can rest now. The history will wait. History always waits. It has, by definition, been waiting for a very long time already. If you enjoyed this story, or if it helped you rest, you might consider leaving a quiet like on this video, or a gentle comment, or perhaps subscribing to the channel so that more stories like this one find their way to you. You do not have to. The story will have been worth telling either way. And now one final slow circuit through some of the quieter details we have passed. Think about the counting houses. The counting houses of the City of London, where men in wool coats sat at high desks and wrote careful letters by candlelight, keeping track of the money that flowed around the world and making sure, insofar as was possible, that more came in than went out. These rooms were quiet rooms. The scratch of quill on paper, the occasional sound of a coal fire settling, the distant noise of the street below coming through wavy glass windows. The men in these rooms were not, for the most part, colourful or dramatic people. They were careful, methodical, diligent people, the kind of people who check their arithmetic twice and are suspicious of shortcuts. And they were, in their quiet, methodical way, among the most powerful people in the world. Think about the archives. In Kew, in a large modern building that looks nothing like the empire it houses, there are miles of shelves containing the records of the British colonial administrations. Every district, every province, every territory that was ever under British control sent its reports and its minutes and its correspondence back to London, and London kept them, because the British administrative tradition has always believed that everything should be written down and kept. The records of the Bengal Presidency, the files of the Colonial Office for Nigeria, the land surveys of Kenya, the court records of the Windward Islands. Most of these files have never been read since they were placed on the shelves. They sit in their acid-free boxes in the climate-controlled stacks, patient and complete, waiting for researchers who will come and read them and find in them the small, specific human details that general histories cannot contain. The letter from a district officer complaining about the state of the roads, the annual report on cattle disease in the Eastern Province, the correspondence between a governor and his superiors about a particular individual who has been causing trouble for the administration, the records of a trial in a colonial court, the evidence of a dispute that the participants cared passionately about and that nobody now remembers. All of that is there, waiting. Think about the ships. The great sailing ships of the East India Company, the Indiamen as they were called, were enormous by the standards of their day. They could carry hundreds of tons of cargo and dozens of passengers, and they were fitted out for the long voyage between England and India with a care and a thoroughness that reflected how much depended on their safe arrival. The voyage took 4 to 6 months each way, depending on the winds and the season. The ship sailed south from England, past Portugal and the Canary Islands, catching the northeast trade winds that carried them across the Atlantic toward the Brazilian coast, then picking up the westerlies that carried them east and south toward the Cape of Good Hope, then east again across the Indian Ocean. It is a very long voyage, and the people who made it repeatedly were marked by it in ways that shape their sense of the world. You spend 6 months at sea, watching the stars change as you move between hemispheres, watching the birds that appear out of the vast blue emptiness as signals of land approaching, watching the albatrosses that follow the ship for days without seeming to land, and you develop a particular sense of the Earth's size. Not the abstract, map-measured size, but the felt, experienced size. The size that takes months to cross. That sense of scale is hard to maintain in a world of air travel, where the same journey takes 12 hours in an aluminum tube 6 miles above the clouds. We live in a world that has lost the felt experience of distance, and with it some of the felt experience of just how large and varied and various the human world is. Think about the tea. Not the geopolitics of tea, not the opium trade and the Chinese wars and the Assam plantations. Just the tea itself. The pot warming on the hob, the measured spoonful of dry leaves, or the bag dropped into the cup with the casual efficiency of a gesture repeated 10,000 times. The water just off the boil, because boiling water makes tea bitter, and the British are particular about this, which is one of the more endearing of their particularities. The colour that blooms through the water as the tea steeps, that first amber cloud, darkening as it diffuses. The addition of milk for those who take it that way, turning the liquid from amber to pale gold. The smell. If you have ever made tea in the late evening in a warm kitchen while rain falls outside, you will know the particular quality of comfort that smell carries with it. It is one of the most civilized smells in the world, and it carries within it, whether you know it or not, the entire vast and complicated story we've been telling tonight. The Indian fields and the Chinese mountains and the company ships and the London counting houses and the cups of a million ordinary evenings. History is everywhere. It is in the tea. It is in the language. It is in the shape of cities and the names of streets and the contents of attics and the faces of people you pass on the street. It is always there, always available, always patient. You just have to slow down enough to notice it. The night is very deep now. Let your thoughts become slow and simple, moving without direction, the way thoughts move in the last moments before sleep. Less connected, less purposeful, just drifting from one thing to another without any particular urgency. Perhaps you are thinking about ships, about the way a ship moves through water at night, the sound of it, low and steady, the wake spreading out behind in the darkness, phosphorescent sometimes in warm seas, glowing faintly green where the hull pushes through the water. Perhaps you're thinking about maps, about the way a map simplifies the world into clean lines and colours, the way the pink-red British territories on the imperial maps filled in a quarter of the world's surface and made it look controlled and orderly and complete, when of course what was inside those pink-red borders was everything that is always inside any patch of ground. The infinite complexity of human lives, the 1,000 specific details that no map can contain. Perhaps you're thinking about nothing very specific at all, just the darkness and the warmth and the faint sound of whatever sounds surround you tonight. The rain, the wind, the soft white noise of a building settling into the night, your own breathing, steady and slow. That is exactly right. There's nothing you need to do with this story. No test to pass, no conclusion to draw, no argument to remember. It is simply there, in the way that history is always simply there, not demanding anything, not requiring anything, just existing in the background of all our present moments like the faint hum of something very old and very large, reminding you that you are one small part of a very long story. And small parts of very long stories are in the end entirely sufficient. They are, in fact, everything. Sleep well. The empire is gone, and its people are still here, in all their complicated, various, irreducible humanness. In London and Lagos, in Delhi and Dublin, in Sydney and Singapore, in Kingston and Karachi. They are waking and sleeping, working and resting, building new things in the spaces where old things ended. The world is very large, and the night is long enough for all of it. Sleep well. If you find rest here, you might like to subscribe to its Sleep Chrono, so that more stories like this one can find you. But for now, there's nothing more to do, and nowhere more to go. Just here. Just this. Just the slow and comfortable dark. Good night.